late medieval, early post-medieval creeping in.
It was the pub.
Right.
And this was the Red Lion, and our little sort of sitting room was the Snugs.
We're following the story of the village of Kibworth in Leicestershire, from the Romans until today. With the help of the villagers, it's the tale of one place through the whole of our history.
Rafter, and then that little cutout.
We've been delving into their attics, prying into their medieval tax records, and we've even traced their family trees. And now we're going to take the tale on, from the Tudors to the Industrial Revolution, from the Civil War to the British Empire. But for the people of Kibworth, history still starts and ends in the village. Here at home, profound changes in the village and the organisation of the fields lead to the end of the old communally organised farming society, most of whose people from now on will be wage-earning, landless workers. It's another step on the way to them becoming us. In the 1530s, seeking to divorce his queen so he could marry Anne Boleyn, King Henry VIII broke with the Church of Rome and made himself head of a new Church of England. That split in the end would turn England into a Protestant country. And in Kibworth, the villagers were now ordered to erase their Catholic past. In September 1538, the vicar of Kibworth, William Pearson, addressed his parishioners, standing here in the church. Told them about the new hard-line reforms from King Henry VIII's government. There was going to be a new English Bible. There had to be a list maintained of all births, deaths and marriages to keep tabs on conformity. And the laity would be tested on their faith regularly to avoid the detestable sin of idolatry. Statues like the beloved Virgin of Kibworth over there had to go. And so did the great crucifix, the painted wooden image of our Lord above the arch in the nave. After the meeting, there was much discussion in the church, and the vicar let his feelings be known. According to an informer, he spake devilishly, and said that had King Henry died 7 years agone, it had been no hurt. Now, to wish King Henry VIII dead was not a wise move, given his attitude to dissent. The vicar was thrown into jail, and it was the beginning of the end for the old religion here in Kibworth. Over the next 20 years, the government forced 4 changes of religion onto the villagers. First with Henry, who kept some Catholic customs, then his son Edward, who was a hardline Protestant, then back to Catholicism under Queen Mary, and finally Henry's Protestant daughter Elizabeth I. For many English people, the Reformation caused a huge psychological wound, but of course life had to go on. In the 3 villages of our parish, Kibworth Harcourt, Kibworth Beecham and Smeaton Westerby, life still revolved around the old cycle of the agricultural year and the open fields. And we can get an insight into their lives during the Reformation from some of the 20,000 Tudor wills in the local record office, with intimate details of home, family and friends. Among them, old Kibworth families.
The Poles.
The Poles, yeah.
That's his own name, it's actually almost illegible.
Here, at the very start of the Reformation, is John Pole.
I bequeath my soul to God Almighty, Our Lady St. Mary, and to all the holy company of heaven, the saints and so on. So this is a very Catholic formula. The Reformation is going on, but he doesn't know much about it. He leaves money for a trental, that is for 30 masses to be said to save his soul. So he's very much a Catholic, and he's very anxious to spend some of his money on his own safety, if you like.
John was a typical old country Catholic, but he's also a rising yeoman farmer.
To his brother Thomas Pole, a gown and a noble. Noble is a gold coin. It's worth 6 shillings and 8 pence. So it's quite a valuable gold coin. And he leaves a ewe and a lamb. Look, he spells ewe, Y-O-O.
Oh, terrific.
Wonderful phonetic spelling.
So John had done well. His farmhouse leased from his landlord, Merton College, Oxford, but over the years he'd bought more land for cash.
2 yard land, 48 acres of land, which by the standards of the time is a substantial amount of land. So you can see immediately he's got the money to buy, and he's buy land, and he has the ambition to acquire land, which he can then hand on to a son who is not due to inherit. They're becoming better off, they're becoming more independent. They see themselves as inhabitants of a village, not as the tenants of a lord.
So under the surface of the great national events, the villagers were quietly improving their material lives. Early in Elizabeth's reign, John Iliff made his will. An old Catholic, now a conforming Protestant, the big thing on John's mind was his house and his property.
John Iliff, husbandman.
John's a husbandman, that's a smallholder, but he's got possessions in every room.
A group of local neighbours would gather to hear their names. You see William Clark and Michael Coxon and so on. They would go to the house, and they would go around the house making a valuation of all his possessions. They start in the hall, which incidentally they spell H-A-U-L-E, and it has the standard furnishings of a table and 2 forms, 2 chairs and so on. It then goes on to say 2 pots, 2 pans and so on.
We're almost at the beginning of the English living room.
Any sense of luxuries? What were English farmers in the 16th century?
Well, they were
buying for themselves,
not big spenders on their furniture, you know. I mean, the valuations they put on their 2 chairs and a cupboard and so on is 3 shillings, not big money. Bit of luxury perhaps in their bedding, the coverlets and so on.
But they're not yet quite like us. Private bedrooms are still only for the rich.
Did we have separate bedrooms by this stage?
No. You have a chamber, so you do have the beginnings of an upstairs room, but in fact what they use that for is to store wool. It's not a living room at all, it's just a storage room.
The Tudor Reformation would haunt England for a long time. It undermined people's most intimate feelings about life, work, and the natural world, about ancestors, about death and the soul. With its Lollard past, maybe Kibworth was more receptive to the new faith than most places, but for many, the loss of their old world left heartache. In the summer of 1580, Elizabeth Clark made her will. An old Catholic, she now makes a resolutely Protestant statement of faith.
I, Elizabeth Clark of Kibworth Beecham, on the 1st of June in the year of our Lord 1580, and the 22nd of the Queen's reign, being of sound and perfect memory, make this my last will and testament. First, I bequeath my soul into the tuition of Jesus Christ, my Creator and Redeemer, and my body to be buried.
But her biggest care is for family and friends.
I give to the poor man's box 12 pence. I bequeath to Agnes, my daughter, 46 shillings and 8 pence. And 20 shillings that was her late sister's part, to be paid unto her at the day of her marriage.
Elizabeth's will marks a silent revolution which took place over about 40 years in Tudor Kibworth.
Elizabeth Clark was buried here in the churchyard at Kibworth, in the Beauchamp half, towards midsummer 1580. It would have been a sober affair, the Protestant clergymen all in black, no incense and requiems and masses, no tolling of the great bell, not even the throwing of flowers on the grave. And with that, a line was drawn under nearly 1,000 years of traditional English Christianity. But what comes out most strongly in Elizabeth's last words in her testament are the old imperatives of a farming community, the importance of land, family, and inheritance, the attachment to neighbours and their children, and care for the poor. The topography of the soul and of salvation may have shifted, but that of the village community had come out even more solid. And Kibworth towards 1600 was a village community no longer of peasants, but of yeoman farmers and husbandmen, bound to each other by their common duties in the open field. But life for ordinary people was still hard. The plague of 1604 killed 77 adults in Kibworth. And then there was the Great Freeze of 1607. For the first time now, we've got images of the village. From 1609, here are the village houses and plots with the names of the families. The male line of the Poles in the village since the 1200s has gone now, but the Parkers, the Iliffs and the Colemans are still doing fine. And a few years later, still in the reign of King James I, here's a plan of the village. What will become the A6 is lined with well-built two-storied houses, all of them now showing the new sign of social status and domestic comfort, chimneys. And here on Main Street, you can still get an idea of the village in 1609. Medieval and Tudor houses, the skin of red Leicestershire brick. They would have been thatched then. And there are those chimneys. They're burning coal now, not wood. Coal brought by local hauliers on carts from the Derbyshire coalfield. Everybody's got 2 fireplaces. The Rays have got 8.
But the Reformation had bequeathed many bitter political and religious divisions. A perfect storm of discontent was brewing, which would now lead the nation and the village into civil war.
The road to civil war really begins when the king dissolves Parliament in 1629. That's the start of what even in Kibworth became known as the 11-year tyranny. The king was spending enormous sums of money on unpopular foreign wars and on the extravagance of the court in London. His taxes caused a fury in places like Kibworth. And by 1640, both sides, the parliamentarians and the king, were preparing to raise armies.
And as civil war loomed, Kibworth found itself literally on the front line. On the Big Dig, we found a first hint of the war right in the middle of the village.
Digging up the Jubilee Gardens here. Hello, good morning.
What's this?
It looks like a stone.
It's perfectly rounded though.
Okay, take it over there, better be safe than sorry.
Is this something?
That's a ball.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And for once, what we found wasn't a surprise.
What did you find, Tom?
It's got a cannonball. Well, that's what we think it is. Yeah, Civil War.
We knew that for a time during the war, the King's army had actually been billeted around the village.
Stone cannonball. That's exactly what I would think it is. Civil War, you reckon?
Yeah.
On the eve of the war, the local gentry on both sides set out to raise armies, and military musters were held in Kibworth itself.
What we have here is the muster roll for the Leicestershire militia from the Gartree 100 in 1639 or 1640.
So this is the raising of troops locally in Leicestershire in the Gartree 100 on the very eve of the Civil War.
That's right. Every now and again the government would say, muster your militia, and that means that they all come together, they do training and drilling and things like that, but they're also counted to make sure that they are all present and correct and properly equipped. They passed muster.
We got Kibworth in it?
Yes, oh yes. Where are we?
Oh, yeah, here we go.
There we are. Kibworth Beecham and Kibworth Harcourt. And you can see that each was sending 4 men, 2 musketeers from Beecham, 1 musketeer from Harcourt, and 2 pikemen and 3 pikemen, respectively.
Oh, terrific.
You've got from Kibworth Beecham, you've got Matthias Wood, he's a musketeer, William Smith, corselet, a pikeman, Richard Lenton, musketeer, John Wilkinson, corselet, and then from Harcourt you've got Thomas Freeman, corselet, William Parker, musketeer, John Drake and Robert Parker, both pikemen.
And what class of people are these drawn from? Are they volunteers, or do you get volunteered by your village?
I think that's nearer. The requirement was that the parish should send 4 men, say, and so long as it sent 4 men, officially they didn't care. If they could find someone who was willing to go, then that was fine. But if not, what you have here is an English military force raised by conscription, in effect. I suspect they tended to be the poorer, perhaps the men dependent on the parish. And the parish would say, you get relief 6 months of the year. On return, off you go, you're a musketeer.
And when it came to the Civil War starting, if you're on this list, do they come knocking on your door saying you've got to join the King's Army now? Would these people have fought as pikemen and musketeers in the Civil War?
They may well have done, but they didn't as militiamen, because of course both the King and Parliament summoned the militia. So in effect they trumped each other, and that was that. What they really fought over was the militia's equipment. What they struggled over in Leicester was the gunpowder that the militia had, and the muskets and the pikemen that the militia had.
And if you want an idea of what it was like to have a Civil War army march into your village, ask the Sealed Knot. They're marching through Kibworth to one of their regular reenactments of the battle nearby at Naseby. Roundheads and Cavaliers, Cromwell's new model army. It's one of those moments in our history that we all recognise.
We've reached the 17th century in the English Civil War, and just as in earlier times, the villagers get swept up in the events of the national story. Before the Battle of Naseby, the Royalist armies camped here in Kibworth.
There's about nearly 3,000 of us in membership.
As always in history, having an army in the village was no fun.
You are very kind. Thank you very much.
There were bitter complaints to Parliament about the looting of food and horses here in Kibworth.
Leicestershire was a divided county, and this village sits on the watershed between Knowsley, which is 5 miles up the road, which is the Parliamentary House, and Wistow Hall, 5 miles up the other way, which was a Royalist house.
Get your shot ring goes down. You then put more wadding on top. So that
I think the engagement of the common man with the national political issues, even then, was quite pronounced. Mass politics is thought to be a 20th and 21st century phenomenon. It's not. It goes way back.
On a main road south, the village was in an exposed position and was occupied at different times by armies from both sides. What happened here over the war years is revealed by the parish register, which suddenly stops being written at all.
1592. So this is the copied up version.
So this is the neat version.
This is the copied up version.
And several folios missing. May we go forward to the English Civil War?
Later, in an apologetic note, the vicar explains why.
Wow.
Blank pages. Blank pages.
Terrific.
Know all men that the reason why little or nothing is registered from this year 1641 until the year 1649 was the civil wars between King Charles and his Parliament, which put all into a confusion till then, and neither ministers nor people could quietly stay at home for one party or the other.
Armies going to and fro.
Armies going to and fro, and also, of course, whether the clergyman fitted in with who was in control or not.
Of course, yes, for one party or the other. You're
That's
in or
right.
you're out.
Dangerous times, but politically dangerous and religious dangerous too. So it may well be you couldn't find the vicar.
Early in the war, the village had a royalist vicar. Later, they had a hard-line Puritan who marched off with the parliamentary forces, arm in arm with the Protestant fundamentalists. 1644, 45, Battle of Naseby, 46, still nothing happening, is there? Let's just move on. Of course, still blank sheets.
The king married a Catholic, and this is a Protestant country. If our monarch marries a Catholic, where will that take us?
Surely it is to convert the rest of the country,
Yes.
to follow their way.
It's popery, isn't it? Popery.
Such opinions drove many Protestants in the parliamentary army, but it was a living.
Sixpence a day is quite a goodly wage.
The decisive battle was fought just south of Kibworth at Naseby in summer 1645. The King's forces were smashed by Parliament's army, commanded by Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell. The defeated royalists streamed north through Kibworth, leaving their dead scattered along the street. For the King, the war was lost. Within a year, King Charles surrendered and Parliament put him on trial and found him guilty of treason against the Commonwealth of England.
The execution of King Charles here in front of the banqueting hall in Whitehall in January 1649 led to an explosion of radical groups in England, but it also opened the floodgates to religious dissenters. A great movement of independents and Presbyterians and Baptists and Quakers who've been fighting for their religious rights for a long time, but who now saw their chance to take on the state itself.
And in their wake was a tide of smaller groups, some of whom were very strange indeed.
Sir, you are welcome, sir. Common people like you would have been not allowed in this building, but now that King Charles is dead, all common people may go inside, yourself included.
Great to see you again.
And you. Been ages.
Fantastic. Great events, though, aren't they? I mean, I got a thrill coming down Whitehall and seeing this. I mean, execution of Charles.
First time it had happened in the light of day ever in Christian Europe, and you can imagine what that meant to people at the time.
Yeah.
Shockwaves.
Now, the aftermath of all this, all these amazing groups kind of come out, don't they?
You mean the religious types?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, yes. The Adamites, the familiarists, the Fifth Monarchy men, all these crazy people believing that women could preach in an open grove instead of having to go to a church.
Nudists, vegetarians.
Yes, what was the world coming to? Great. And of course Cromwell had to put a stop to all this, because otherwise once you challenge authority, that challenges Cromwell's authority.
So they let the genie out of the bag, did they?
Well, they
Mark?
did rather, and put it straight back in again.
Parliament had fought the war for a political cause, but now religion began to take over. Radical groups who wanted to dethrone the Church of England from its position of authority. These religious rebels became known as dissenters or nonconformists. It's easy to forget how important religious dissent has been in our history. Many of the liberties we take for granted today were gained by dissenters. But at the time, the government saw such groups as a real threat. Even the Quakers.
This is a copy of an order received in December 1668 and it's been copied into the book. It's addressed to Lieutenant Bale and the rest of the other commissioned officers in the militia troop of Captain George Faunt, who lived at Foston, which is, you know, an easy day's ride, less than that really from Kibworth. And it says that there are great numbers of persons commonly called Quakers that assemble and meet together under the pretence of joining in a religious worship at Smeaton in the parish of Kibworth and diverse other places, and it orders Lieutenant Bale to gather his troops together and to go and arrest or disperse them. So this is, you know, this is quite remarkable, isn't it? You know, so they're Quakers, they're a threat, and it says that they're joining in under the pretence of religious worship. Yeah. So they're not even accepting that they are actually carrying out genuine religious worship.
Today we don't associate Quakers with the kind of violent assemblies and sedition and threats to the state,
Certainly
do we?
not.
And now Kibworth itself became a centre for dissenting groups. They got a legal place of worship in 1672, when government spies reported nearly 200 people of the middling sort from Kibworth and other villages. And they would be a major presence in Kibworth until today. These groups were fighting for freedoms we take for granted now, freedom of speech, freedom of worship. In this time of religious and political turmoil in the late 1600s, we get the first national and local newspapers. And education was a particular focus for the dissenters, who saw that knowledge was power.
After the Restoration Act in 1660, Kibworth became a centre for people who expressed different opinions. One person was Reverend John Jennings, and he lived at West Langton Hall running a church for dissenters there. And as they grew, they went to the stables which was behind the White House, once known as the Old Crown Inn, in Kibworth Harcourt.
And the White House is still here. Later a pub. The dissenters' first meeting place is a private house today.
So this is the main road before the building of the turnpike and the modern A6, isn't it? With coaching inns all along it.
We're sitting here now, behind the Old Crown Inn. 51 and 53 Leicester Road at present. Now known as the White House, and of course at one point it was completely white, painted.
Wow. And we're looking for the nonconformists who were so kind of important in Kibworth in the 17th century, and all the old accounts say that the very first place of worship which they leased out was in a stable or a building behind what was later the Old Crown Inn. They talk about some sort of stable buildings or something like that behind.
The stable and the loft were just behind us there.
There used to be more sticking out here, didn't there? It used to go much further back there.
Do we know how big the congregation was in those days, John? Or...
I think it was around about 150 initially.
I read somewhere as well that there was nobody of any note in the congregation, now, which is quite strange, so everybody was either keeping a low profile about it.
Yes. Ordinary Kibworth people, presumably. Just ordinary farm workers' houses being used for the gatherings.
Until, of course, they were destroyed by fire. And at that point they decided they would build a congregational chapel, which was paid for by public subscription.
One of the dissenters' biggest complaints was that they were denied a proper education as they were barred from university. So here in Kibworth, they decided to provide a top-quality higher education for their community, a dissenting academy, an alternative university. Great thought, isn't it? Kibworth constantly surprises. The Academy of Kibworth, and it's had a national fame, didn't it, in the 18th century?
We've always known that Kibworth is important, but I mean, you don't actually realise how much it has had an impact on learning and other things that are going on in the country.
It's almost in opposition to Oxford and Cambridge, isn't it? It's a sort of dissenters aren't allowed to go to Oxford and Cambridge because they won't do the appropriate oaths and all that sort of stuff, and the allegiance to the church, so they can't go. So they set up an academy here, and what's amazing about it, I don't know whether you've had a look at it, but the curriculum was amazing. I mean, you could do Greek, Latin, Italian, French, geography, they did science.
And one extraordinary product of the academy who's only now being rediscovered, was the daughter of one of the teachers, Anna Letitia Barbeau, born Anna Aiken in Kibworth in 1743, a woman who understood that our political and religious freedoms depend on education.
This is another fable called The Young Mouse. A young mouse lived in a cupboard where sweetmeats were kept. She dined every day upon biscuit, marmalade or fine sugar. Never had any little mouse lived so well.
Poet, anti-slavery and anti-war agitator, Anna was also a pioneering writer of children's books.
Charles, what are eyes for?
Seeing!
What are ears for?
Hearing!
What is the tongue for?
Talking!
What are teeth for?
Eating!
What is the nose for?
Smelling!
And what are legs for?
Walking!
Then do not make Mama carry you. Walk yourself.
She begged her father to be taught Latin and a little Greek, which was very unusual in those days, and reluctantly he agreed. But her mother was very upset because she thought that it would make her not a marriageable prospect in the end if she was too
Latin and
intimate.
Greek?
Yes, she would be too clever.
Wow.
But in fact, that wasn't true. She did have a number of proposals in the end, despite her intellect.
Men seem to have fallen in love with her by the sound of it.
Exactly, including possibly the French revolutionary Jean Marat, who it was later on killed in his bath by a woman.
Yes.
But he spent some time in the academy. She starts off as a poet, and it's said that every library in the country had a copy of these poems. She also went on to write against the injustices of the age, the fact that she, as a dissenter and as part of the community of dissenters, didn't have proper civil rights. But then she said that it was one of the most impressive things that a person could do is to lay the foundations of the future in a child's mind.
On the contrary, are very troublesome and mischievous. Therefore,
she really revolutionised how children's literature should be presented. In the methods that she used, quite a lot of her work is dialogic, so the child and the mother, usually it's the mother, talk to each other and explore the world in a language which is very clear and plain and is designed to make the child think.
She's a real hero, and in Kibworth, no longer forgotten.
Possessed of great beauty, distinct traces of which she retained to the latest of her life. Her person was slender, her complexion exquisitely fair, with the bloom of perfect health. Her features regular and elegant, and her dark blue eyes beamed with the light of wit and fancy. I wonder if anyone would describe me like that. My husband was all the time to his friends.
Charismatic woman, then.
Absolutely.
It's a combination of the beauty and the actual education that made her this kind of draw card.
Ideas change us. They're the motor of progress. And in the 18th century, Kibworth opened up to the world in other ways too. The turnpike from London to Leicester was run through the village, a specially surfaced toll road. The village became a stop on the route north, and 24 coaches a day were fed and watered in its coaching inns.
If you look at the little fragments that are coming up.
And in the big dig, we found their traces.
The exception is chamber pots. We've got a couple of rims from chamber pots. We're also getting quite a bit of oyster shell. Well, I just wonder if we've got a pub round here sometime between about 1618 and 1750.
Yes. Kibworth, of course, you've got a huge number of inns over there, 1700s, 17th, 18th century, because of the road to Market Harbour and to London.
That clay pipe is not Victorian, it's older. If you look at the shape of the bowl, that's a sort of, wouldn't be surprised if that's an 18th century clay pipe, maybe 17th century.
It's actually all along Main Street. It looks as if there were coaching inns with their big coach entry doors, doesn't it?
It's very obviously an awful lot of pottery being trashed, and that's all the way along here. So that's the sort of thing you'd expect to see something like an inn. A lot of
So it's
high
coaching
consumption.
in 9 miles. It's coaching in's 9 miles south of Leicester. A lot of people stopping here. I mean, rumours that there were other entertainments on offer besides drinking food.
So the big dig had come up trumps once again.
I found a human finger bone.
You found a human finger bone?
Yeah.
God, some poor old person lost their finger on a trip to shops. That's absolutely terrible, isn't it?
The finds from the big dig suggested that by the 1700s, England's population had recovered to the level it had before the Black Death.
This does seem to be quite indicative of real growth, and of course some of the other finds as well are telling us the same story.
From the mid-Tudor period, 1550, maybe 3 million, is doubled by 1700, isn't it? And you can see it in there.
But a revolution in agriculture was now bringing a huge increase in productivity. The old communal medieval strip system was no longer economic, too labour-intensive. In the landlord's archive in Merton College, Oxford, the great map of the open fields was about to be rolled away forever.
Topographical description and a brief relation of the manor of Kibworth Harcourt in the county of Leicester. And still presumably working as an open field.
The big local landowners wanted to scrap the open fields, consolidate their holdings into larger economic units. The money was now in grazing, in sheep and wool. The strip fields had had their day.
These are the ridges and furrows left by the medieval plough teams all those centuries ago, just going up and down this hillside.
On the 21st of April 1779, at the Old Crown Inn, a meeting was held where local landowners, led by the Hames, the Foxtons, the Humphreys, voted for the enclosure of the common fields, which was duly ratified by Act of Parliament.
It was the great national robbery, when the common lands were filched from the poor, whose heritage they were, and apportioned among the surrounding landowners. Rank robbery.
So all around us, the post-enclosure landscape of Kibworth. Green pasture and sheep grazing everywhere. But at our feet, the ridge and furrow left by the medieval ploughmen. The deep bone structure of their world. The enclosures of the 18th century were a turning point in the story of the village, as they were for communities all over England. Nearly 900-year tradition of communal labour out in these field strips, every one of which had its own name. Peashill Sick, the Blacklands, Banwell Furlong. The old mental map of the village, gone forever.
This massive social and economic change has long been seen as marking the transition from feudalism to capitalism.
Does that make any sense to you? And what do we mean by that when we talk about these things?
I still think that phraseology, dated as it is, still encapsulates the very real changes that are going on. The decline of the peasantry, the rise of the farmer, the decline of the community, the rise of the individual, the end of the open fields and the development of the enclosures, the production for partly at least for the consumption of your own household, and now increasingly entirely for the market, specialising for the market. I mean, these are big changes in the way which people behave, and that can be summed up by that phrase, moving from feudalism to capitalism.
Inevitably, the biggest losers in the enclosures were the poor. Compensation was often minimal, and many were forced out of work, and some into crime.
First of all, welcome. I can't believe that we met up. So tell us.
Jean and Neil Beasley have come all the way from Australia to try to find out about their Kibworth ancestor, Charles Beasley. He was a highwayman condemned to death back in 1793.
And one of them was Charles Beasley from Kibworth Beecham,
and here we are.
Now, you're Beasley's, yeah?
He's a direct bloodline.
Fantastic. And you're the researcher, are you?
I'm the
Jean? Is that-
researcher.
Great stuff. Born in Kibworth, comes from a big family, do we know?
It was a big family. I had about 7 children, but Pat has informed me that it was 12.
There were 12 children, but 5 of them died.
Yes.
in
Right,
infancy. This is the actual register. So,
fantastic.
So this is Charles's baptism. This is the page for the christenings of 1776, and there we are. Charles William Beasley. Well, it's spelled Beasley. There are a lot of spellings.
Yes. Well, we quite understand that a lot of them couldn't read or write.
Charles William Beasley, son of Henry and Susanna Beasley, born December 6th, baptised December 19th, 1776. I'm holding the book.
Beasley, it turned out, was a teenage tearaway, the son of unemployed framework knitters.
We knew that he'd been in trouble with the law and that he'd robbed a stagecoach, and also that he had robbed a shop. But we didn't know he belonged to a gang.
Because the trial was in the Old Bailey, wasn't it?
Yes.
And the Old Bailey...
and with the help of the National Archive, we found the transcript of the trial.
This is Driscoll, who's one of the ones who's going to be executed here. On the day of the robbery, Beasley, Rabbits and I. It sounds like a Roald Dahl story, doesn't it? They purchased a pair of pistols. John Rabbits and Charles Beasley were indicted for feloniously making an assault on the King's Highway on James Sayer on the 11th of July. And lo and behold, there's the full transcript here with the eyewitnesses. A little man jumped into the chaise with the pistol in his hand. And he said, "Damn your eyes, your money, or I'll blow your bloody eyes out." Fantastic. And I said, "I don't know what the matter is, but take that thing away from my head and I'll give you my money." So I put my hand into my pocket and gave him 2.5 guineas. And he stepped back on the step of the chaise and he looked at it and he said, "Damn your eyes, you've got more money than this about you." And he stepped back out. And I said, "You damn rascals, shut the door after you. After taking my money. I will have you if I never have another." And I immediately jumped out of the chaise and called out, "Stop thief!" And people came out of the Rose and Crown public house and pursued them. And they get him. And then the verdict, Charles Beasley, guilty. Death.
Spared because he was only 16, Beasley was transported to Australia, to a new life, and the beginning of the story of a new nation.
Here we are, trying to pursue the sort of, the heart of the English story, the quintessential English story, and suddenly our village broadens out to being the Australian story.
If they'd hung him, he wouldn't have been here.
I know, it's an amazing tale, isn't it?
It's more than we'd hoped to find. Much more. And emotionally, it'll probably take a while to leave, I think.
So with feminists and highwaymen, 18th century Kibworth was full of surprises. But it was the canals that really opened the village to the world. The Grand Union Canal was dug along the southern edge of Kibworth parish during the 1790s.
This is the coming of a new age, this is the Industrial Revolution coming into the countryside of Kibworth.
Close by, Foxton Locks is one of the engineering feats of the age, at the junction of what was then Britain's newest transport system. They're no longer carrying heavy goods today, but the canals are as busy as ever.
So the villagers of Kibworth, which is there, isn't it?
Yes.
Would,
the
coal for their fires would be unloaded here off the boats.
Yeah. A lot of timber from there, I gather.
But
Amazing to think, isn't it?
Yeah.
The kind of pre-motorways and pre-trains.
Yeah.
This was the.
That was the main sort of way of getting round and everything.
Could you go down to London from here
Yeah,
if you wanted
can
to?
go if up Foxton Locks, and then you go down to the Grand Union through Rugby, and then down to London.
That's
and
where
go down
the
the
people
Oxford.
were going, weren't they?
Yeah,
Tremendous. So where next?
Hey, where next? We're going down to the River Severn, aren't
Going
we?
on the Avon and the Severn next, down to Tewkesbury.
Yeah, a couple of weeks' time with
Got a party down there.
Chap down the river there.
It improved transport so much. Before the canals arrived, if you wanted coal delivering, if it didn't arrive before September, you probably wasn't going to get there. The roads would just disappear in the mud. The horse pulling a narrowboat full of coal can shift 25 tonnes. Same horse on the road's going to be struggling to pull a tonne. Cut the cost of coal by half. But not only that, they could then get their own goods out, because everything you can imagine went by boat. There's even records of a boatload of bulldogs going to the Leicester show.
So the canals were a crucial catalyst in the rise of industrial England.
The canals and the turnpikes brought about a revolution in transport in England, maybe the biggest since the Roman roads, for now even a rural village like Kibworth was connected to a national transport network and beyond that to a global trading system as the British Empire spread its power across the world.
Tom Gamble of Kibworth was on the Fighting Temeraire at Trafalgar. Rob Shaw fought with Wellington. Rob Fletcher signed up for the East India Company and did 20 years in the plains of Hindustan. And back in Kibworth on the Village History Day, among the Roman brooches and Anglo-Saxon coins brought in by local metal detectorists, there was even a hat badge from the 1820s in India.
Here we got Hindustan. That old-fashioned spelling goes onto a U.
But many people also brought in memorabilia from the industry which from now on will dominate their village.
The famous garage.
I've heard stories from more than one people. Oh, you should have seen Bert's garage for this.
Yeah.
I don't believe it. A vampire jet in the
No, not that one, but this. The framework knitting industry.
This was a big industry in this part of the world, presumably,
it was partly local history, but he was a sales director for a knitting machine.
Local engineer and history enthusiast Bert Aggers saved many old machines.
Thing of taking all these things apart, putting them back together again, making them work.
This is just amazing here, isn't it? You know, that's one of the original old machines, isn't it, from the 19th century?
Framework knitting was a major industry in the East Midlands from around 1700 till the 1950s. Making hosiery, clothes and gloves, it employed 500,000 people.
Nice and gently.
This is the old factory near Kibworth at Wigston.
This is the workshop. This was built in 1890.
Come on then, gang, all go in.
At its height, there were 100,000 machines across the East Midlands in homes and factories like this. Closed down and locked up in the 1950s, the factories literally stopped in time.
So this is the workshop, where the men would work 12 hours a day if work was available. These frames are 200, 300 years old, we're not quite sure. They've been recobbled time and time again. And this is a winding machine which winds bobbin of yarn from the hank onto the cone. And miss, would you like to come here? If you put your hand on there and you turn it round, you'll have to reach up. Can you see? Bring it onto the bobbin so there's no tension. Again, adding to the noise of the plate. Righto, Miss Hawke. Otherwise, I've got to spend all afternoon winding it back. I don't want to do that. Initially, these frames would have been in your kitchen in Kibworth, but Master Osier, who owned the house, brought all the frames into here so he got control over the workforce and the yarn.
They have to do it on the weekend as well.
No, they didn't work on Sundays.
What did they make on these machines?
Gloves, which was a highly specialised job. And with a glove like that, there's your cuff, there's your palm, and there is your thumb.
And what kind of people worked here? How old were they?
The children in the family would come here as apprentices or go somewhere to learn it. And we know to learn to be an apprentice, they would stand here watching the man operate the frame, and it was a 7-year apprenticeship to become a fully qualified framework knitter. There is instances, I don't believe it, where they chained somebody to this so they didn't get away. Yeah.
It was repetitive work that demanded fierce concentration.
Would you like to sit on here and have a go, sir?
Okay.
Come on, George Henry. Do you want one? Can you do it, Melda?
Now, don't lose any fingers, though, will you?
Can you reach the hands on here and press those in? Pull this forward. Right.
But in places like Kibworth, it was often the only work available for landless workers.
Well done.
Whose families were long-term unemployed in the decades after the enclosures.
Take your foot off and bring it forward. Look here, look at all the stitches you dropped. Look here. You'd soon be out the door and on the dole. Nice and evenly, that end.
A later invention was the Griswold. Small and movable, you could use it in your living room. So simple, even a child could do it. With your own Griswold, in hock to the owners, you really could end up chained to your machine. In Kibworth Beecham and Smeaton, frame knitting became the main employer. Many families worked together at home. And with Nicky and Bob Tully and their children, we discovered the story of one family of framework knitters who'd lived in their house 170 years before.
We've lived here 25 years now. The terrace itself was originally a workhouse, we believe, circa 1770, something like that. And then in the 1800s, it was turned into private dwellings. And I think if you see the different coloured brick up there, that actually says Smeaton Terrace.
You can actually see the letter A just above the right-hand edge of the window frame.
Yes, absolutely. From deduction, you can tell that the floors are sort of concrete or equivalent. I don't know whether concrete was about in 1770, but there's a layer of concrete and then the straw layer underneath. So it was obviously built for something substantial.
It's most likely that the tenants of the houses, when it was sold in 1836, were framework knitters, and that would explain for the floor being strengthened, and also explain the windows because they needed an awful lot of light.
Yeah. I mean, we just before I came up, I did a little trawl in the National Archive, and it's a bit difficult to read. Do you want to have a look at that, Nikki? It's the parish of. You can see it's the parish of Smeaton Westerby, selling off a building that was owned by the parish. So presumably up to the workhouse up to that point.
Yes.
It's got a series of people, Robert Iliff, John Johnson, Job Johnson and others, who were framework knitters or seamers of stockings and this kind of stuff. I mean, Job Johnson must have been, if he was 42 in the 1851 census, then he's in his 20s at that time.
Right.
They've all got families clearly working with them, I think.
Initially, it was a very good way of making a living. A lot of people were attracted to this area to do it and expanded and expanded. But gradually, as the markets contracted, still more people were going in, so it's growth, overproduction, and the living standards began to fall very badly. So that by the 1840s, framework knitters were in terrible straits. And in 1843, 25,000 framework knitters from Leicestershire, Derbyshire, and Nottinghamshire would petition Parliament saying we want a commission to regulate wages and regulating disputes. So we've got this on report where they recorded all the witness statements, and it's a sort of vignette into what's happening to the industry at that time. And the nice thing is we've got two witnesses from Smeaton Westerby, and one of them is Job Johnson, who we know is living in this area.
From this terrace, and it's a family business, is that right?
Well, this was the big problem.
Yeah, I mean, Bob would be at the machine,
Yes.
Nikki would be...
You'd be doing the seaming, and you'd be doing the winding.
What will Charlie be doing?
Oh, you'd be big enough to be at frame, I'm sorry.
Looking after your smaller brothers and sisters.
And the little girl puts in the frame at 9. I don't know, are you old enough?
Oh, yeah.
So this is your terrace in the 1840s.
Job Johnson.
I'm Job Johnson of Smeaton. I work 14 hours a day. I have to feed my wife, myself and 5 children. I have no money to send them to day school, for until this year I was paid in goods or tokens, not in money.
It was nearly always paid in goods, not cash.
Well, there were a number of problems oppressing the frame witnesses, and one of them was truck payments. Now, truck payments is payments in goods or tokens that you could only use at your employer's shop.
Just
Instead
like
of
in the
ready
Great
money.
Depression in America.
Yes, and it was actually made illegal in 1831. This is 1843, but no one had told the frame witnesses, so it was still carrying on. And they bitterly resented it because they were so open to exploitation by the employer. When they were being paid poor wages anyway, it was a real... well, they talk about being a tyranny of oppression. It was a real problem.
Well, you're literally working to live. There was no spare. They're paying out their own expenses, the frame rent, carriage rent, seaming.
As their wages fell so disastrously at the beginning of the 19th century, frame rent actually went up. There are people in Kibworth who say they can't afford bread, so they're just eating potatoes 4 times a day.
They can't afford bread?
No.
I am by trade a framework knitter and have a wife and 1 child. 1 child I have lately buried, and my wife is far advanced in pregnancy. I am reduced to the greatest distress and have no means to procure the common necessities of life.
There is no race of people under the sun so depressed as we are, who work the hours we do for the money we get. It would be my delight to bring my family up to a school. I cannot bear the thought of bringing up a family in ignorance, so as not to read a little.
They've been bricked in, but you see what they were originally.
And you can see the floor where it goes right down where the machines were and where their feet used to move.
Oh, yeah. Oh, right, yeah.
The voices of these poor stockiners, weavers and Luddites are only now being rescued from what one modern historian called the enormous condescension of posterity. But they weren't just victims of history. Like their medieval ancestors, they were also its makers. Out of their struggles in the early 19th century, in part inspired by nonconformity, a new England began to emerge. The peasants had become the working class, and their time had come in English history. The education the framework knitters dreamed of would follow, and with education would come representation.
Copperplate handwriting. You are to do the A and the B and the C and so on.
And the creation of a working-class culture with sport, music, entertainment, humour, which is still the basis of our popular culture today.
The theme of our next song, Miss Ellie McCann.
And next, in the final chapter of the story, the Victorians, the World Wars, and us.
Good evening!
The Story of England continues next Wednesday night on BBC HD at midnight 25. Tonight, Dan Snow continues his theory on how the Celts saved Britain. That's next.